In today's episode, Dr. David K. Bernard responds to a listener's question about whether Christians should participate in boycotts when companies and corporations adopt policies that contradict the biblical worldview. Dr. Bernard's answer is coming up next on Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. Welcome to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, a podcast dedicated to helping modern-day believers live out the teachings of the first century church. This podcast is part of the teaching ministry of Dr. David K. Bernard. Dr. Bernard has dedicated his life to studying the Bible and helping believers apply its message to their daily lives. In Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, Dr. Bernard answers your questions about what the Bible teaches and how those teachings apply to everyday life. If you enjoy this podcast, we encourage you to check out Dr. David K. Bernard's books. Dr. Bernard has written more than 30 books on biblical theology and Christian living and leadership. Visit pentecostalpublishing.com and search David Bernard for a list of available titles. Enter promo code DKB10 at checkout to save 10% on your order. That's pentecostalpublishing.com, promo code DKB10 to save 10% at checkout. Thank you for joining us. One of our audience members asked the following question about whether Christians should participate in bans or boycotts. This person wrote, they gave their example. They asked, is it okay to purchase from companies that have come out in support of, and they mentioned a controversial issue that I won't share here, but then this person then cites a list of some of the world's largest and most prestigious companies that have supported what this individual views as policies that are contrary to a biblical worldview. And they add, Scripture says that if we love God and then we love what He loves and hate what He hates, they note that I do love God, but I don't see that I would want to that I should get rid of. And then they cite an extremely popular consumer product that many of us own and not buy products from, and they list off several popular retailers. What are your thoughts on this issue? Should Christians participate in bans or boycotts?
My brief answer this is a matter of Christian liberty. Under Romans 14, some Christians will feel one way, other Christians will feel another way. And I think each one can decide according to his or her conscience, but not condemn another Christian that has a different perspective. So let me try to go a little bit further. So how would you evaluate? Well, if a company is directly supporting something you violently disagree with, it's their reason for existence, it's their main business, it's what they're promoting, then that would be a strong case to avoid it. So companies that their product is cigarettes or tobacco or alcohol or gambling or prostitution or abortion, we might say that's their business. I'm not going to support that whatsoever. On the other hand, you have many corporations or even mutual funds that might invest in some things as a sideline, or indirectly they might be supportive as part of the overall economy. Well, as the connection gets further and further, I think there's a less emphasis that we would feel directly responsible. And I think that even goes back to Scripture, because Scripture, for example, the New Testament says to pay our taxes. Well, if you study what the U.S. government, for example, spends its money on, some of the things that we strongly disapprove of, the government supports. So should we withhold our taxes? And so I think what the New Testament is saying, no, you're not accountable for the subsequent decisions of a government to spend money in ways that you wouldn't approve of. You're only responsible for supporting the lawful government with its lawful taxes. So I think you can make a similar argument that if I'm buying a product from a company, I'm not supporting other things that company does. I'm paying for that particular product. Now, if I'm buying a sinful product, maybe I'm guilty. But if I'm buying a neutral or positive product, it's not my responsibility or my fault that they might use some of that profits for something else I don't like. I mean, if you take that logic, anybody that you hire, they might go out and spend your money to get drunk. So, I'm not going to hire them because they're going to use the money that I gave them. but that's their responsibility. So I think a reasonable case can be made both ways. If you feel like your supporting of a company is directly supporting an evil product, you might say, I'm going to abstain, especially if you feel like our collective action might help that company change. But are you guilty of what that company does? Are you honor bound not to support or buy products from any such company? Well, I don't think so, because you can make the counter argument. What I'm buying is something useful, beneficial, neutral. I'm not responsible for what other things that company does with their profit or with the collective money. And so I think this is pragmatic, because in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10, it's kind of a similar argument. What if someone offers food to idols? Can you eat it? And Paul says, well, if you go to a feast and you don't know where the food comes from, just eat it. Don't ask questions. Or if you go to the market, maybe some food was offered to idols, offered to the temple ends up selling it back on the market. It's actually food offered to idols. You don't know that. Well, just buy it. You can't just avoid all commerce. But if you go to your neighbor's house and your neighbor says, oh, by the way, I offered this to an idol, come participate, then Paul says, don't do it, because not for your sake, but for the weaker brother's sake, that a new convert looking at that might say, oh, you're supporting idolatry. So in essence, Paul's making a similar pragmatic argument. If you eat the food, you're not meaning whatever else they use the food for. You're not responsible. But if it's brought to your attention in such a way that looks like you're supporting that idolatry, then you don't do it. So I think we can make a similar argument or a similar rationale of we can segregate the immediate use from maybe the extended use several steps down the road that we're not responsible for or accountable for. So I think that kind of analysis can come here, and some people will choose one or the other. So is it okay to join a boycott if you really feel this issue is morally objectionable and you really feel like the boycott can make a difference? Well, then yes, it's okay. Is it required for you to boycott? Then I think no. The answer is no. If you're not directly responsible, then I don't think it would be wrong to participate in the economy. As another example, in 1 Corinthians 6, Paul talks about don't have fellowship with idolaters and adulterers and so forth. And he says, wait a minute, I'm not saying don't have fellowship with people in the world who are guilty of these sins, because then you couldn't live in the world. But he says, I'm talking about a believer. If someone who's in the church claims to be a fellow Christian and they're living in open, unrepented sin, such as adultery or drunkenness or idolatry, well, you can't have fellowship with them, because now you're condoning their sin and now you're bringing a reproach on the church. So again, looking at this issue of boycotts, should you try to abstain from all commerce that has been affected by evil? Well, actually, you probably can't live in the world if you study every single corporation, everything they do. But so I think we restrict it. If my participation is going to look like to maybe new converts or to unbelievers that I'm trying to win, if my participation is going to look like I'm supporting sin, then I shouldn't do it. But if my participation is just a part of being part of the larger economy, then I'm not accountable for what happens, and therefore I have a choice. So my answer is Christians should think about this, pray about this, and then decide how they wish to participate in our modern economy.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. We also appreciate it when you share Apostolic Life in the 21st Century with a friend or family member. And make plans to join us again next time as we look at how the Bible applies to everyday life.